cultural respect, and Indigenous rights. As we commemorate the 25th anniversary celebration at the University of Utah of the late Martin Luther King Jr., let's not forget that he fought for the rights of all underrepresented communities, and most importantly, Indigenous issues that still continue on today. Our struggles, and it is for that reason that I think that most of us can agree that ethnocultural respect can have multiple meanings to different people. Ethnocultural respect can encompass a person's own form of identity and respect for their culture. And it is with this reason that we have invited academic and cultural scholars to remind us that the struggles that Indigenous peoples around the globe are still faced with today. So I will introduce Jennifer Napier-Pierce. She is a KUR correspondent, and she will be the moderator for today's panel. And to my left, I have Ed Navia, and he's a community activist. We have Dr. Dolores Calderon, and she's the assistant professor for Education, Culture, and Society at the University of Utah, and Roberta Winchie-Ridley, and she is a facilitator of Indigenous communities and storyteller. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and have them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about themselves. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here today. I want to thank Matthew for inviting me over. Before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, where I come from, my educational background, and some of the things I do as a traditional and cultural person. I was really surprised today when I walked in. I met a lady, and she's sitting over here somewhere. She said, "Hey, you're that old jingle dress dancer." I said, "Yeah, I know." She didn't say old. She said, "You're that jingle dress dancer." And I felt like saying, "Yeah, I'm that old jingle dress dancer." Anyway, I was raised at the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana. My people are the Assiniboine Sioux people. What that means is that during the introduction of non-Indian people to natives, we had this group of people, the Cree people, the Chippewa Cree people, and when they were introduced to the white people, they asked who these people were, meaning us. Who are those people over there? And of course, the Chippewa Cree people, they gave them the name that they call us, which is a Sneepawin, which means cooks with a stone and uses stones to cook. And so a Sneepawin became a Assiniboine. We call ourselves Nakota. We're a band of the Sioux-speaking tribes. There's a Lakota, the Dakota, and the Nakota people. The Lakota is probably the most famous that all of you are aware of, which is the City of Gold, Little Bighorn, and Custer, and all that. But the language base we have is the same. We have, if you're speaking Lakota, you use an L. If you speak Dakota, you use a D. If you use my language, you use the N. And our words are all pretty similar. Like when we say God, we say Wakantanga. That's what we all say. I grew up there at Fort Belknap, being raised by my grandfather, Winchief, and my grandmother, Olive Bennett Winchief. Winchief was a traditional person. He was a Sundance leader and a pipe man. And when I was a young child, I remember watching him when he would do his pipe ceremonies and listening to him when he would address the spirits that he talked to as he took his pipe around. And one of the things that always impressed me about him, and impresses me more in this time, is that he would always say, and we do, all our Indian tribes across the United States, we always say we are all related. And Itakuwasin, which is meaning that everything has life, everything is interrelated. And there's a whole movement today of people that's going that way. Eckhart Tolle's talking about that, Oprah, everybody's talking about the universe and how we're all related and all has life. And our Indian people knew that, years ago. And one of the things that I used to always wonder is how did my grandpa know which is the shortest day of the year, which is the longest day of the year? And I remember that he would have ceremonies at certain times of the year. My mother was only about 16 when I was born, so therefore I was raised by my grandparents. My grandmother was half Indian. Her father was, his name was Franklin Bennett, and he was from Scotland. And when we talk about diversity, native rights, we talk about things that, the difficulties that people put ourselves into and other people put on us. That's what I always saw with my grandmother. I saw her as being totally, truly more Indian than a full-blood Indian walking down the street, because she knew more, she talked about it, she taught it, she lived it, and yet she was half. And I know that our people would sometimes look down upon it. They call her Washichu, they call her, she's white. She didn't feel that way. She felt totally Indian. I remember I was probably around 7 or 8 years old, and we were in town, and she had her shawl on and her moccasins and her braided hair. And the other ladies had, I guess in the 40s and about 46, they wore those flip-top things, and they were dressed like that. And I kind of resented that. I told my grandmother, I said, why don't you dress like that? I said, you look more white than they do. If they're trying to be white, then why can't you just dress like they dress? Because you have light hair, you have gray eyes, why don't you do that? And she just looked at me in Indian. She said, this is me. And that's all she said. And I never really, I quit talking because I knew when I heard a certain tone of voice, I didn't push anything. I just kind of like, okay. And later on, I realized what she was talking about. That we as people, regardless of who we are in our lives, and who we are as Indian people, as non-Indian people, as people, we come from a certain point in our life, and that's always good. And we need to continue to hang on to that. We talk about resilience. I was reading the little notes we should allude to. I think our people have had the ability to survive and will have the ability to survive because we have a way of life and a teaching that's in us, regardless of whether we sat down as a child and taught that, or we just have that feeling. Because one time my grandmother told me that my brother married a non-Indian, my uncle did, and we were beginning to have the Indian blood be a little bit, not there that much. And my mom, she said that no matter how much or how little Indian blood you have, if you feel that need and that feeling as an Indian person, that attachment to the earth, to the universe, to other people, that's all you need, even if your blood is only a little. Because I was thinking about that one time, and I was thinking that I was giving a speech somewhere, and I was in a large crowd of people, and I said, how many of you people in here, and there was probably no Indians, I said, how many people in here have been told in your background you have Indian blood? And there was a lot of people that raised their hands. I mean, it's not all Cherokees either. They were all different groups of people. But I think that's what really impressed me, is that there's a feeling of being Indian, and we all know that. And we all can't push that aside. And so that's where our strength will come from, is that ability to know that who you are, like my grandmother said, this is me. Even though she had her moccasins, and in a time when all the other Indian ladies were wearing street clothes and high heel shoes, having their hair cut, she wasn't doing that. And I think that's what will take us through, is a feeling like that. And we all have that feeling. Then after I got to be a teenager, I ended up marrying a Chippewa Cree from Rocky Boy Reservation, and I have 4 children. I have 11 grandchildren. I have 7 great-grandchildren, and one of my great-grandsons is sitting in the back over there. His name is Jonathan Graycloud. So I've been taking care of him and enjoying myself doing it. I retired. I ended up realizing that in order to survive from the reservation I come from, which is just nothing, there's nothing there, there's no, there's nothing there. No industry, no way to make a good living. I knew that I had to go to school. So I went to a small Catholic college in Montana, and I got my bachelor's degree in American history. Then I went on and went to the University of Oklahoma. I got a Master of Public Health and a PhD, and I worked for like 32 years for Indian Health Service. I went to the University of Minnesota, and I received an executive management fellowship that I completed. But all of that, and I look at that now and I think, well, I got all those papers. What did I do with them? how did I make anybody's life better? And I think that's what it is. The education, you get that, and then you're able to see more, you're able to do more, you're there for your people. In 1986, the granddaughter that I raised, her name is Ollie Denny, was born, and at that time, my kid's dad decided he needed a change. He wanted to go back to the reservation and live there, and I got a divorce. Or he got a divorce. And I ended up raising my granddaughter and marrying a real nice person, a wonderful man. He's back there. His name is Elliot Ridley. He changed his name to Eagle Chief in honor of my mom. But I ended up, like I said, retiring as the service unit director or the CEO for the health services for the state of the Indians in the state of Utah. And since I've been retired, I started another thing. I started jingle dancing. I started powwowing. But all the years that I raised my kids, I made sure they were involved in powwow. And I always made sure that they knew they were in the sweat lodges, and they went to the sun dances, and they went to NAC meetings. My ex-husband did that all for my kids as their father. He taught them a lot of those things. And so my children were raised pretty much in the powwow circle or Native American church with me through the Sundance, because Wind Chief was a Sundance man. And so I always stuck close to that and knew that that part of my life is what took me forward among non-Indian people, because even in the 70s when I was going to school, there was a lot of prejudice. There wasn't many people my age. I'll be 69 years old on the 19th of January. And I said, all these years, I was telling my sister, I hit 30 and I thought people said, now it's downhill. But it wasn't. I said, when I hit 40, I thought, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to, because of this youth, the way the American people look at youth, you can't get old, you always try to be young. Anyway, every time I hit a time like 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, I kept thinking, when am I going to feel like I'm that age, I still haven't. I got one more year of being 69. Maybe when I'm 70, I'll think that, that this is what it is to be old, because I don't feel that way yet. But anyway, I started with my jingle dress dancing. I made sure that I did it the ceremonial way that was taught to us as Indian people. When I was 14 years old at the Fort Peck Reservation at Poplar, they had what they call the Poplar Oil Celebration. And I was only about 14, and there was 4 of us girls. My grandparents knew some Ojibwe people from Red Lake, Minnesota, and those ladies were jingle dress dancing, and I wanted to do that. So my grandparents asked them to teach us how to do that, to tell us the ceremony behind that, to tell us the meaning of it, and to tell us what we needed to do. So I did. My grandparents did that for 4 of us. And so we started jingle dancing, and I think I was about 14 in 1954 or something like that. But that didn't last. That dance kind of went away, so we all got into fancy shawl and other things. But after I got with my present husband, I started dancing again. Before I danced, I did the whole ceremony. Today, they don't do that. Today, some of the, and it's good, today it's good what they do. I'm not saying it's not good, but I think a lot of the things that we used to have, we still have parts of it, but we don't have all of them. And it's kind of like where we've lost some things. And I think it's up to the people, young people like my nephew, and I'm real thankful for him because he's gotten to be very traditional. He has tried to bring a lot of that back to our family, and he's done a good job of it. I'm proud of him for doing that. But traditionally, I've always tried to do those things. With my great-grandson, I'm trying to follow the traditions that I was taught, and I think most of us do that. You know, most of us, we do that, we just don't talk about it. I think even those that live off the reservation and live in the city, they do all those things, they just don't talk about it. Should I quit talking now and let someone else? How are we going to do it? Are you the moderator?
No, that would be good.
Oh, I guess that's all I have to say for now.
Are you going to sit down when you speak?
Probably not at the beginning, but when we address these questions.
The format is very loose, and we were going to hear from each of them maybe for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for some questions. So if I could invite Ed Napia.
I guess it's me next.
Willing to go next?
Ti hei Māori ora, ko te mea tiutahi kei te hiahia hau ki miha atu ki a koutou e huihui mai I tēnei rā, I te whare wānanga o Utah. Ka tino nui te āroha ki a koutou e huihui mai nei ko ngā kaiariki, ko ngā kairangatira I tēnei wā. My name is Ed Napia. First of all, I acknowledge what my people call the people of the land who have kept this land warm for those of us who came later. I'm also happy that Roberta was the first speaker, because even though physically this room was warm, philosophically and emotionally it wasn't warm for me, and I'm glad that she was able to do that to warm it up a little. I am a member of the Ngāpuhi Iwi, or the Ngāpuhi tribe, the Te Whiu Hapu and the Te Pōpoto Hapu, which are sub-tribes, Te Pōpoto and Te Whiu, from the Taitokerau district of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in many ways I'm a little bit different from the other panelists. When I woke up this morning, I didn't really have anything to say to you that would enlighten you in any way, and I hope that during the course of this that may change. I'd just like to let you know that my father, his last occupation was that he was a bus driver, and my mother used to clean bathrooms and hallways in a geriatric hospital. Both my parents have since deceased. I think they brought us up they tried to bring us up to be good people. I'm not sure if they succeeded. But they certainly had a lot to do with who I am. Now, I was just thinking as I was sitting here that I've gotten myself into another bind, because, as I say, the parents who raised me are deceased. But my soul is kept warm in the house of Henry and Louise Kutch, who live on the Northern Ute Reservation. And I was just thinking here, I don't know if I can go through the trauma of losing parents all over again. And as they get old, it's something that I have to look forward to. Sometimes I can say things that offend people. Sometimes it makes me feel good, but not very often. I'd sort of like to let you know a little bit of what we call the Turanga Waiwai, or the piece of land on which I stand in terms of the topic that we are here to discuss today. And I'll try and do it in a gentle way, but sometimes I'm not successful. I find myself continually embroiled in debates over issues concerning the people of this land, the American Indian tribes. And it gets a little frustrating because the more I become involved, the more I realize that people who are not native don't completely understand American Indian, I don't want to say American Indianness, but the political nature of American Indian tribes that I can't say that I'm an expert on, but you know, I've hung out with Nola and Dan, and I don't know if that's a good recipe for becoming a great personality. And I don't regret that. But you know, I want to state this succinctly and simply. Maybe that means the same thing, I'm not sure. American Indians are unlike any other group in this nation, and I recognize that. They are not an ethnic group, although they are quite often referred to as an ethnic group. You might say they are many ethnic groups, but they are political entities. And when I hear people complaining about some of the extra services that American Indians seem to get, kind of angers me, because these people don't realize that American Indians, by virtue of their treaties, have prepaid for their health, education, and economic development. Nobody else has. They have, and if you want to see the bill of sale, it's called treaties. And so I'm going to answer a question that we were emailed right now. As an Indigenous person from another land, and by the way, I recognize that I'm part of the colonizing machine because I'm not native to this land, that my responsibility as a person who was born up, raised as an Indigenous people in another place is to support the Indigenous rights of Native people in this land. That is my primary goal, and then I can think of myself afterwards. Now, I'm just saying that I'm not real good at it, but at least I recognize that that is the way that it should be. And if I were to live in a South African country, in an African country, I would feel it would be my responsibility to support the Indigenous rights of the Indigenous people of that land. I'm going to say something that might offend some of you because I think it needs to be said. I was raised, in fact, in the church in which my family practices. We have been in that church for 7 generations. I would be 5th generation, but I don't consider myself a practicing member of that religion. And, you know, I deal in substance abuse and mental health, and I have to say that Christians need to take ownership for the damage they've done to the native psyche. You know, sometimes we think we bring them what they need, we save them. But, you know, I don't believe that Christianity has given us all the needs that we need in terms of being balanced people. It focuses basically on one area and sometimes on other areas, and that's spirituality. But, you know, I think those of us from who are tribal people realize that there's more to who we are than spirituality. And in fact, I think the medicine wheel is a good metaphor for that, because you need to look at spirituality, physical, mental, and social. And we need to address all those areas. And I don't think that Christianity has brought some peace to some people, but I do believe that it's brought a lot of dysfunctionality to others. And I'm so glad that Roberta talked about this issue of identity and culture and, you know, these terms, where are they? Cultural preservation and the importance of traditional protocol. That's such a, I don't want to say it's a messy issue, but it's such a difficult issue to deal with because identity and culture change through time and space. And quite often when we think about cultural preservation, it's more like keeping culture in a time warp, so that we inhibit its ability to move through time and space. You know, if I were a major traditionalist, I might say, you know, all those girls who, and I've seen it, you know, where they started coming out with what's those shiny things? The little sequins and stuff on their outfits. You know, I think some people might say that it's not a good thing, but I say, well, you know, it's it's evidence of a mechanism of culture moving through time and through space. And I think that cultures need to be responsive because I think culture is all about survival, and we need to do all that we need to do to survive. And I'm thinking, and I think Nolan and I have talked about this, that, if when the colonizers came, they just let the tribes here be as they be and do as they do, this nation might look vastly different. Perhaps we might have more what we call tauiwi, or non-Indigenous people is the best translation, who have a deeper understanding instead of a sort of like a crystal understanding of American Indian spirituality, because I think culture's to be shared, but after your all 10 fingers get burnt and your toes start getting burnt, then you become a little bit careful about how you share those things that are very valuable to you. I think, as I thought about today, I couldn't come up with any good answers, except that I think I can take a philosophical approach. And my understanding of philosophy, because I choose to identify it myself, is that philosophy is about finding the questions rather than finding the answers. Because in the looking for the questions, I think the universe reveals itself. I don't know if there's much more that I need to say. Oh, the most important thing I think for me in my life is relationships. It's not how much money you have, what kind of house you live in, that might enhance your relationships, but that thing that is most important, I think, to humanity is the relationships that we develop with one another. I consider myself a recovering academic. I think academic has given me the language to analyze my life. The only problem is I didn't know where to stop, and I started over-analyzing myself. And sometimes when you over-analyze yourself, as I was doing with these questions last night and this morning, you lose a lot of sleep. And if you know Maoris, we like two things. At the top of the list is food, and the very next is sleep. And quite often that may be why after we eat, we like to sleep. Maybe that's a human thing. I also like to acknowledge that I feel in many ways that I am influenced in some difficult ways by colonization. I have a lot to say about that, but that might be for another time. And one of them is, if you don't mind me sharing the fact that, I'm diabetic, and colonization brought that because my genes were not designed to assimilate the type of food that I was introduced to. And so if I get a little woozy, actually, you can use that as an excuse if you want to sort of like end the conversation and just say, oh, I'm feeling dizzy, it must be my blood levels. I'm going to stop there before I continue to put my foot in my mouth and start chewing my shoe. Thank you.
Our next speaker will be Dolores Calderon, and I also want to introduce Ella Daisy. She's the director of the Indian Welcome Center. So, following Dolores, we'll hear from you.
All right. Hello. Thank you for
Hello.
the invitation. I'm happy to be here and following everybody. I think it's kind of a nice segue. We're all kind of speaking to similar issues. Obviously, we got prompts, but I wanted to start with maybe the reason why I'm here, and that's particularly from speaking about my background. I am Tigua, Pueblo, Isleta del Sur, and Mexican. And if you don't know anything about the Tigua, you know that we are a tiny reservation in El Paso, Texas, at the westernmost tip of Texas on the border with Mexico and New Mexico. And one of the things that I know about that experience is that we have an intimate understanding of the changing of the nation state. That's obviously can be a very academic term, but within the context of my community, it's something we understand very intimately. Getting caught up on both sides of different nations. When the river decided to change, we were on the Texas side. When the river decided to change again, we were on the Mexican side. So then what did they decide to do? They decided to straighten out the river, concrete it up, so that wouldn't happen again. So those are the kinds of stories that I've heard about how our community has survived throughout relocations and throughout this last century of being ignored for part of it, and also fighting back. And I think that that's what's important about my experiences. It speaks to the experiences of Indigenous peoples, not as static people, but as people who negotiate, as people who understand very well what they need to do to protect, to continue, and to persevere. And particularly within, I don't speak Tiwa, which is the language that my people speak, but I do know certain terminology, and very interestingly enough, a lot of Spanish words have been adopted, obviously because of the long contact with the Spanish, and in particular, the one word that has been adopted within the Tiwa language is called costumbre, custom. And that was in referring to relationships with the Spanish. And what that tells you is that those relationships had a lot to do with law, about the laws that defined what access you had to water. And as you know, in the Southwest, access to water is a big thing. And for the southern pueblos, most southern pueblos exist along the Rio Grande. And so that history is very central to who we are as a people. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, is how water, specifically water rights, have become very important to a lot of tribes in the United States. And when we think about water rights, and I think this is connected to what Ed was talking about, this is something that as Indigenous peoples in courts have battled for a long time. And again, I'm speaking, it's no coincidence that one of the first cases to treat water rights was the Winters v. United States case in 1908. Involving the Milk River on the Fort Belknap Reservation. And so, you know, it's interesting that we're all up here and somehow these histories join us together in very, very interesting ways. So what are the Winters' rights? I'm going to read a couple of things about what the Winters' rights are. Basically, Winters' rights are reserved water rights for Indian tribes. The Winters Doctrine in law basically is that when the federal government established reservations, and this is again connecting to what Ed was talking about those early agreements, treaties that were made, the government implicitly reserved a quantity of water necessary to fulfill the purposes of the reservation. The doctrine was based on principles of reservation establishment and construction, that Indian tribes retained all rights not explicitly given away. So if you understand anything about treaties, there were certain rights that were given away in exchange for other things. So these were the broad purposes, right, of the Winters Doctrine: to obtain sufficient water use, for example, for agriculture, for livestock, domestic, recreational, cultural, and we'll get back to that, cultural and other uses. Part of that was a practicable irrigable acreage standard, which is just a fancy way of saying how much water does your tribe need to do the basic daily things that peoples need to do. But in addition to this, in 1976, as a result of an amendment to the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, the EPA was authorized to treat tribes as states for purposes of grant and contract assistance. And this was important. And this is what I want to stress here, is that many times we think of tribes as very static, being acted against, but what I want to emphasize here is that tribes in fact are not, and that they act, and that they very, very purposefully use specific mechanisms, such as courts, to maintain and preserve particular rights. So this allowed tribes to, in effect, take effective action to protect water rights. And one of the first tribes to do this was the Pueblo Isleta in New Mexico. Located immediately south of the city of Albuquerque, next to the Rio Grande, and again, getting back to this issue of how we're all connected. The river goes down all the way through New Mexico, and it comes through Texas, and it empties out into the Gulf of Mexico. So they were the first tribe in the nation to receive treatment as state status, which is in short tax, from the EPA. And this had important ramifications not only for the Pueblo of Isleta, but also for the city of Albuquerque. And what they did is that despite the outcry of the city, because the city of Albuquerque was not happy at all with this tribe standards, the tribe was able to impose water standards on the city and have the city abide by those standards. And basically, what they were able to do was maintain water standards appropriate for the cultural use of water within the tribe. And that had never been done before. The Pueblo's contention, specifically that of Isleta, was that tribal religious ceremonies, or the right of tribal members to practice their religion as it had existed since time immemorial, was adversely impacted by the contamination of the river. Tribal members were unable to ingest the water or immerse in it for ceremonial purposes, and thus they were able to establish their own water usage rights on the city of Albuquerque. And I state that and I repeat that because I think it's important to understand that indigenous rights exist on a plane that, echoing Ed, that may not for other groups, and that's because tribes are sovereign nations, and as such have a unique status and a unique interactions with the federal government that other groups don't have. And I think sometimes that gets lost in conversations where we talk about ethnic rights. Ethnic rights exist on a different plane, on a different, even legal status. So once you start exploring federal Indian law, it becomes very obvious how very different those two rights are. As a matter of fact, we're all here very familiar with the case of the University of California v. Bakke. Yes? Yeah? Do we know it, or should I talk about it? Bakke was basically a case in which a medical student sued and if I'm getting it wrong, people jump in please, this is as informal as we hope it can be with this kind of setup. The University of Berkeley, California for admittance, because they had set-asides for minority candidates. And what was interesting in that is that the University of California tried to use a case dealing with American Indian set-asides, in the case was called Mankari, as a justification for these set-asides. But interestingly, the Supreme Court said, wait, you can't use that because American Indians are minorities. American Indians have specific agreements with the United States. And that's what Mankari was about. It was about BIA set-asides for American Indians, and the court differentiated those rights. Now, I'm not saying we look to the Supreme Court to inform ourselves as to the rights of Indians, because those rights, if you look at from tribe to tribe, those rights take different courses as how they've been exercised. But I think it's important to understand those very basic components of Indian rights. And I think that globally, a lot of indigenous peoples have suffered because they haven't been recognized in the same way. And that's one of the things that the UN Charter for Indigenous Rights has been trying to institute. But as you know, countries like the US and Canada have been unwilling to sign that. And why is that? Does anybody have any idea? I'd like this to be more interactive, but that's okay. Because they don't want to recognize or give away too many of those rights, or give tribes more of that inherent power that they are vested with. And so those are the challenges that indigenous peoples all over the world face, is how do you get these state governments, these nation-state governments, to recognize those rights that existed before those colonists came? How do you get nation-states to agree to the fact that tribal peoples have particular rights apart from the nation-state? And that begins to get to other deeper questions that
other Indigenous scholars that are very active in Indigenous rights movements are getting to. And that's particularly the final question that I'll leave you with. And this is a kind of an academic question, but at the same time it's not, because it gets back to this idea of costumbre, custom. And that is, and specifically I'm drawing from the work of Dwayne Champagne, who was my mentor at UCLA, is our nation states as they are constituted today, the United States, constructed in such a way where they can honor Indigenous rights? And his answer is clearly no. We need to look towards a different formulation, maybe what he calls a multinational state, that can begin to open up its democratic processes to not only Indigenous peoples, to subnations such as transnational peoples who demand and articulate a different set of rights. And I think we see that struggling on the news, in our daily lives. And what that is that the context that we live in today is so constrained because the way we think about people and the rights that they are enabled with is such a limited view of what the possibilities are. And I think Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of that movement. Indigenous peoples are at the forefront of defining what these rights should look like, what these relationships should look like. And I'm very humbly proud to be a part of that, although I went to law school with hopes of doing that kind of work. It became clear that that was a much harder job to do than just going to law school. And that aside, law school was an interesting experience for me. But I'm also very happy that I did it because it gave me an understanding of really how sophisticated tribes are, of how sophisticated they are in their dealings with the US government and their dealings with state governments, because you get to see this time and again, states trying to take away those rights, trying to get more rights from the federal government to deal with tribes. So it again brings me back to this notion, to these ideas that I grew up with as a kid. Hearing the grandfathers, hearing them talk about dealing with these different levels of government, dealing with these different levels of laws, and negotiating them, and understanding them in a way that not too many people talk about, but that need to be brought into these spaces, because those are really the people's, those are really the experiences that I think can lead us forward. So with that, I'd like to end. Thank you.
I just introduced myself to you now. I am of the Many Goats clan. My parents are traditional healers and traditional leaders of the small northern part of the reservation in a small town called Toronto, Arizona. That's where I'm from. I'm the current executive director at the Indian Walk-In Center. And I am grateful to be here and asked to be part of this panel. I did receive the questions that you were talking about late last night, and I kind of just went over in my head of where shall I begin, what shall I talk about. And I think these individuals up here have talked about a lot of the things that went through my mind. There are a lot of ways to address these issues. Before I go into that, I just want to talk a little bit about myself. I grew up on the reservation. My first language was Navajo. I did not learn how to speak English until I was about 7 years old. Well, I'm still learning how to speak English. So my parents have always taught me to never forget where I'm from, who I am, who my clanship is, and what my history is all about as far as traditional comes. They've also, at the same time, emphasized school. Go get as much education as you can. Go out there. Go learn the white ways, they used to say. And then we come back and tell them about what we're learning in school. And my father used to always say, that's not so hard to learn. that's just basic instinct for us. Didn't you know that? You know, so that kind of brought me to understand a lot of the different ways of thinking and a lot of the Western ways of thinking, to understand it that way. That's how I made it through school. And being the last of 10 children, there was a lot of expectations set on me. My parents have always paved the way and tried to make things easier for me to achieve things. And I was the first out of 10 children to attend a university. I got my undergraduate degree from the University of Arizona. And then I moved here in Utah about 10, 11 years ago. And started my master's degree program here. And my sisters, a couple of them followed. And now a couple of my sisters do have their bachelor's degree, and a couple of them are pursuing their master's degree, so I'm so proud of them. Although they're much older than me, much wiser than me, it was that piece of paper that they needed to get ahead. So, with regards to the questions that were given to us, I think each time a culture is lost, we lose an entire irreplaceable and exquisite way of being, way of life. I think culture is like the highest expression of what it means to be human. And once that's stripped away from you, people are lost. You are lost. You don't know where to go. And in that sense, I've always taught my kids, I have 3 girls, to hang on to their old arts, their old way of life, to keep it alive, to always talk to Grandma, to talk to me about questions that they may have. This gives them the basic understanding of who they are, so they can move further in life and make their lives much more meaningful. And I'm sorry, I'm coming down with a cold, so if I lose my voice, you can come talk to me when you get closer up. Anyway, and where I wanted to come from is just that from the youth perspective. I mean, we have lived so far in our lives, and we understand the difficulties and the diversity and the adversary that we face as these years go by. But our children are innocent. They don't know what's going to happen to them in the future. So that's where I want to come from. We need to teach our children I hate to say the old ways of lives, but the lives that our ancestors, the lives that our grandparents, the lives that my parents are living. They need to embrace that, hold on to it so they can move forward with it. And they are the future of our way of being. And the questions that I've got here, one of them talks about resilience. I think that we need to put into place like protective factors for our children, like having them feel like they belong, having them feel like they're valued in this society. And some of those protective factors, being the agency directors, is services, providing them mental health services, providing them cultural education services, providing them a holistic type of services so they can be able to create for themselves a strong identity and a strong connection to not only their history, but to the land and to what we have here, and to use that to continue, like I said before earlier, culture is the highest expression of who we are. And for children, this is what they need to embrace. We need to remind them every day, and they also look to us to give them that education, to lead them to that positive path of life. So there are a lot more that we can speak to, but I just wanted to focus on the future of our children and how that is very important as Indigenous peoples. And they'll be the ones standing up here years from now and being involved in these kind of panel discussions and the future of who we are.
Thank you all for your comments today. Again, this is kind of fast and loose, so we'll be taking questions until about 1:30, just to get the discussion started. I've heard terms like preserving culture, like survival, negotiating, resilience. These all have loaded meanings, but within the context of respect and Indigenous rights, how do you do that? How do you preserve a culture and still find ways to have that culture be alive and move forward, as you mentioned, Ed? And maybe each of you could just take a stab at that question for a couple of minutes. Ella?
Like I said earlier, cultural preservation is very important. How do we preserve a culture is just to pass it on to the next generation, like I talked about. To put in those teachings that our children will carry on through the future. One of the specific things that I also wanted to touch on is how, in the ways of preserving culture, is to start going back and looking at ways that our grandparents, our elders, how did they manage to address their medical concerns? They've used herbal remedies. They've done singings. They have traditional healing methods. They have what we call medicine men. Gapping those type of knowledge and not gapping, but using those type of knowledge and incorporating what is going on in the Western society or the new technologies, incorporating those old values with what is new now can make it even stronger, and that's one of the ways that we can preserve culture.
I guess I see the preservation of culture through ceremonies and the language. And one of the things that helped me as I was growing up on the Fort Belknap Reservation was being able to see my grandparents, the way they incorporated a way of life that they lived. And it was kindness towards people, it was prayers, it was certain times of the year, certain ceremonies were going on. It was naming of children. It was introductions into different societies that we have among our tribes. And it started at a young age, and I was able to be involved in that from the time I was a child, named in a Sundance Lodge. And then I carried those on, my ex-husband and I carried those on through our children. And it just ended up being, to me, to go on to the future is to do the same thing. Each generation needs to look at the values that we have as Indian people, the teachings that we have, and through our language, the language base that we have, and carry that on from one generation to the next, even though we have to interact with the non-Indian society. We have to also, in my way of thinking, as I've reached the age that I have, is to help them. Because to me, they don't have that touch to the association to the earth and to the humanity. So I think that the values that are just common to all people need to be incorporated in the ceremonial ways of our people, and we all have different kinds of ceremonies. We all come from reservations that have those kinds of teachings. We all have a language that is unique to our tribes that we can continue to hang on to.
Hello? As an educator, one of the important things, and I think I'm stressing what everybody said, is language. Not only language preservation, but moving on to language revitalization programs versus just preserving the language so it can become a living and everyday part of the community, because without language, language really is for Indigenous peoples the repository of a lot of the knowledge and the ways of being. So language is very important. And I know contexts change from tribe to tribe. For myself, I can say that my life is radically different from the life of my father. My father, for example, grew up collecting firewood, doing traditional rabbit hunts, and that's never existed for me. I grew up in the comforts of a modern home. So the challenge is myself. The challenge is people like me. How do we, outside of the communities we're from, maintain and help those revitalization projects? And for me, the best way that I've seen that possible is through the work that I'm doing, because I necessarily don't speak the language, but there's other things that I can do to make sure that those practices are there for the youth that are coming and that are the recipients and the beneficiaries of that.
As I alluded to earlier, I actually have a problem with the word preservation. It reminds me of the fact that, you know, at a certain time of year, my aunts and my grandmother would get together, and well, the kids would have to pick the fruit, and they'd put them in preserves, and then put them in bottles, and put them on the shelf, and bring them back when you need them. And so I have a, you know, that preservation word has a little bit of distaste in my mouth. Unfortunately, I haven't come up with a better word. You know, even maintenance sounds so mechanical. But to keep cultures living and alive is, I think, the idea that I like. And language is really at the heart, I think, of understanding who you are. But I'd also like to add, for those of you who think your language is lost, I'm not sure that is so. In white man's terms, it's lost. It may be lost. And to cite an example, my tribe, you know, we're a seafaring people, right? But my tribe had lost the ability to build river canoes. It was just not being done. And then one of my relatives started having dreams, and so he got a group of people together and started following his dreams to build a canoe. And when they'd get to a part where they didn't know where to go next, they'd stop. And through a series of dreams, he actually brought back the art of canoe building to our people. Now, Māori people are fortunate because their language was preserved in the context of their funerary rites. I think the funerary rites were seen as a very benign institution that wouldn't get in the way of assimilation. But in fact, in the funerary rites, every element of who you were was preserved, including the language. Hawaiians are fortunate because their language and their soul was preserved in the art of hula, which went underground when the missionaries tried to stamp it out. So even though it might seem that the language is gone, I'm not convinced that that's so. So language is certainly at the heart of it, but more importantly, culture is so complex, and we have children who are what's the right word? Multiracial sounds wrong to me, but come from many genealogies. Okay, so I argue that the basic unit of culture is the individual, and the individual must put together their recipe for their cultural person. But we who are here are responsible to give them as many choices as possible, so that if we can tell them all the different backgrounds that they can come from, then let them create what that recipe is for their own personal soul.
Again, this is an open discussion, so if you have questions, feel free to go to the mic. If not, I'll just keep going, because I have a lot of questions. No takers. Okay. Can we talk a little bit about self-determination? When we talk about Indigenous rights and respect, we hear self-determination a lot. And I'm curious, just what does that mean to you as an individual and as a member of your tribe? Roberta?
Okay.
Go first?
Okay, fine. I guess self-determination, when I hear that term, I think about some of the laws that are some of the policies that were put into place for Native people, for they called self-determination, to determine your own, as a government, to determine the way you were going to interact with the states and with the federal government. And they came up with a lot of different programs for self-determination. And a lot of them people are still doing those things, I guess. But as an individual, self-determination, I guess, just to me would mean to be able to survive in a world that's very complex, to be able to know that you have the ability to survive in a culture that's not your own culture. And when I was going to school in the 50s and 60s, I used to know that I knew that there was a certain way that I needed to be among my parents and my grandparents, and a certain way I needed to be among the non-Indian people. Many of the things that I did weren't acknowledged. I mean, we just kind of like went under, like who said underground or something. We didn't do those things in public, like ceremonies, especially the Sundance, that was banned for a long time. A lot of our religious rights were taken away. I think it was 1978 when the Freedom of Religion Act was finally given to Native people. And if you think about that, how could you, a people has to be very determined as a group, self-determined as a group, as individually self-determined, to keep that culture, to keep that language, to keep it going, with all the things that was going against them. So I guess I just have a problem with self-determination. I don't know how to explain it, but it's part of an individual, a community. It's part of the overall, like the legal policies that were placed upon us. I just don't know how to answer that, I guess.
I don't know if I'm simplifying it, but to me, self-determination is just taking back what was already ours and having the free will to practice the way we want it to be. So that's basically the way I understand self-determination. I had the opportunity to sit in on a panel discussion yesterday, and I heard that the Navajo tribe themselves, under their Self-Determination Act, are going to create their own education system rather than going by the state requirements. So that's an example of what self-determination is.
There's the sort of like the official political term, right? Where tribes were given the right to, create their own governments. That's not what happened. They were given a charter that they had to follow. So was that really self-determination? I'm thinking that maybe not. But I think in the spiritual, philosophical sense, I think it's what has been said. It's the right to choose your own lives, even if that happens to be a road to destruction. I think that's your right.
Just really quickly, because I think what I'm going to say is going to echo what folks have said here, is that there's two different kinds, and I think that's really important to understand, understandings of self-determination. And one is what happens in the legal realm, and two is to understand that these tribal people's rights, if you will, for lack of a better term, to self-determination precede any relationships with the United States and are based in tribe-specific cosmologies, tribe-specific stories about themselves. That's where the inherent power to sovereignty and to govern your community comes from. And I just like to stress that, because a lot of times we think it just originates in the relationship with the U.S. government, when in fact it does not.
Questions? I'll keep going. Okay, well, to follow up on that then, talk about the role that governments or government entities can play, and I know that you touched on this. I read somewhere, it was in, I think it was in the prologue to the United Nations Human Rights Charter. In many countries, indigenous peoples peoples rank highest on such underdevelopment indicators as the proportion of people in jail, the illiteracy rate, unemployment rate, they face discrimination in schools, they're exploited in the workplace. In some countries, they're not even allowed to study their own languages in schools. And because of this tension, this historical tension between governments and tribes, what hope do you have now? Do you look to official nation states to kind of close that gap? Dolores?
I think there's a saying, it's the perpetual Indian report, and that's that they're always coming out with reports from the federal government on what can be done. And I think if you just look at the history, and I'm talking only about the U.S. context here, of what goes on, it's I think a lot of people refer to it as like the pendulum of Indian rights. It swings back and forth. It's like one day you're good and then the next day you're bad. And I think that's just, people recognize that. And so that's something you're always struggling against. It's like, okay, well, what are they going to take away tomorrow and what are they going to give us today? And those are the things that you work against, understanding that that's how the nation state works. And, you know, I know it's kind of a dark, or I don't want to be negative, but I don't know if the modern nation state is really fully equipped or willing to deal with Indigenous peoples as sovereign peoples, because it's a challenge to their land claim. It's a challenge to their claim of territory. It disrupts that. So I don't ever see a point in the way things are currently kind of conceived that we could exist on a, I guess for lack of a better term, equal playing field in terms of political rights.
Well, just let me say one thing about language preservation. If you're going to wait for the government to do it, don't hold your breath, because it's not going to happen.
Ella or Bernie? Or our special guest?
You might have more to say.
I think they've touched on both of them. Okay. What was it going to say?
I know you were distracted. Just on what kind of trust you put in the nation state to uphold Indigenous rights, if any?
Not a lot. Coming from a health care perspective, each year the urban Indian programs have been zeroed out every year for the past 5 years. So we continue to go up to legislative and start advocating on behalf of our peoples. I don't know if that's ever going to end because of the misconception of what American Indian health status is at this point as far as insurance. Indian Health Services is not an insurance. It's part of the treaty agreement that all American Indians have a ability to access those services. And being American Indian also off the reservation is different and challenging for us, and we've always tried to say, hey, we're still Indians no matter where we are in the world. Those are one of the challenges that are consistently being us being challenged with. So I don't know how long that's going to take and how far out we're going to continue dealing with these type of issues.
Because Indigenous peoples, it's kind of a broad amorphous term, and there are so many different sections of that community. Do you look more to the international community for human rights help, or do you look to your more local affiliates here in the United States? Okay.
I'd just like to say a little bit about that. I worked for 30 some years with Indian Health Service, and during that time there was just a slow gradual process of eliminating the treaty rights that we had as Native people. There was a slow process of eliminating that. The goal for the government at one time was by 1998 they would no longer have Indian Health Service or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A policy came into place where they called it compacting or contracting. And tribes were given allotted a certain amount of money, and they could have the government run it, or they could run it themselves. A lot of the tribes across the country are compacting. They're taking all the financial money that's allowed to a tribe, and they're running it themselves. And this process is gradually letting go of the rights of Native people. I don't know how far along, since I have not been involved in working the way I did before. I don't know how far along that is, but I understand now that they're doing a lot of things like charging health insurance. Their Medicaid is going into everything is happening, so we're not getting the rights that we should have, the money that we should have. I know.
I just wanted to add, you know, and sort of like acknowledge that actually Ella is my boss. So I'm glad that I'm where I'm supposed to be, so she can check up on me. But I'd also like to add the fact that I think we've revised our mission statement. It's not official yet, but our mission statement at the Indian Walk-In Center kind of centers around the fact that we want to help the U.S. government keep the promises that they made to Native people, which of course have not been kept.
Other questions? Really? Yes, can you step up to the microphone? Thank you.
Yeah. Might I add too that you know, Nola and I have been friends for a long time, and as we have compared the history of my people and her people, it's pretty parallel. Except by the time, you know, we're about 100 years later, and by then the colonizers had become a little bit more sophisticated, and their assimilation practices were likewise sophisticated, so things crept up on us before we knew it. But there came to a point where we kind of realized what was going on, and the one difference between ourselves and the indigenous people of this land is that all our tribes fall under one treaty. Our 500 chiefs signed the same treaty, which incidentally, the version that there were two versions. There was the English version and the Maori version, and they didn't say the same thing. But most, the 500 chiefs signed the Maori version, and about 40 signed the English version, and the Maori language actually says what was meant in our best interest, where the English version does not.
Taking a backseat to other immediate issues. Anyone want to take a step on that one?
Yeah, we'll go. Wow. How can you answer that question in a little bit? I guess that's a thing you deal with on a daily basis. And I'd say, I think for me, the biggest impact of colonialism on my own life is, I think we talked about how, you know, we had parents and community people tell us, go on to education, go on and do this. But you don't realize the price you pay in doing that, at least for myself. And I know that that's the experience a lot of people have shared, in that, in, for example, getting the PhD or whatever that is there's too much being demanded of students to give of themselves, and there's no reciprocation in terms of what students can get back. And the feeling that that leaves with the community is something that, doesn't get talked a lot about outside particular circles, but it's something that we need to talk about within, because the price that students are asked to pay is very, very high. It's an emotional level that I don't think other folks necessarily understand. And I get moved by it because it's something that I live with on a daily basis, being away from home. And I think those are things that we have to be aware of.
And actually, I resonate very much with what you have to say, because I think people don't understand the price that it pays, the price that we have to pay to become educated. It's a horrific price. I remember sitting at my computer when my mother was dying at home in New Zealand, and that was a horrible price to be here while she was dying. And I think the other part of the coin too is that colonization may have created this mindset that has stopped people from trying to continue to be human. Maybe it's described as a welfare mindset. I'm not sure what that is, but we have to break out of that mindset. But also acknowledging the fact that a person such as myself is part colonizer and part colonized, and I'm not sure if I can peel away that part of me that is colonized. But it's part of acknowledging the multi-person that I am and just moving on from that point, also acknowledging the other people's right to exist in the way that they choose.
Well, colonization is still working on us to this day, of course. Divide and conquer is one of the concepts that this came about from, like, I was reading some the Navajo Times the other day, and this kind of just reminds me of that, of colonization and dividing and conquer, where the Navajo Nation is still trying to come to terms with the agreements between the coal mine and the Hopi tribe. And that's just one example of how colonization has taken a negative effect between a lot of tribes that worked together in the past, are now working against each other for something that they don't really, it's not really innate, and it's not really what they value. It's just a concept that they are being used against both tribes, and there's no agreement in between them. So that's just another example of what colonization has done. And I don't know how long it will take for us to realize that we're not puppets anymore. We need to unite and fight against those type of laws and statutes that are out there.
I guess I'd just like to address this on an individual level. I don't know. My uncle, his name was Chris Winchief, and he got his degree probably in the 30s, 1930, leaving the reservation, and yet he was still able to hold on to that tie to the reservation. When I went to school, like I said, I kind of like, maybe I was schizophrenic, but I did the Indian thing over here and the white thing over here, the education over here. I just kind of like had to do it, so we did it. And I don't think I gave up anything. I think I learned, I think it helped me. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the term, but to me, I think it goes back to the individual as being able to know that all these things happened to us. So they did. We got all these treaties, we got these things going, but we live today. And today we do the best we can. And that's how I lived my life, and that's, and so I guess giving up, I don't understand giving up anything. I think I gained a lot through education. I held on to a lot, but I had to do it in a way that was probably unique from other people, because I did it with with being totally native on one side with ceremonies and prayers and all the things that go with that, move out there in the non-Indian world and do what you have to do there. So I must be misunderstanding the term, but it seemed okay with me.
Any other questions? Do you have one? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, I guess, yes. Would you like to step to the mic?
Okay, so I'm a student here at the University of Utah. Thank you to the speakers for coming and sharing your heart, your spirit. It seems to be straight on this trail that I'm walking, and sometimes we wonder why, what are we doing? So thank you for my head to my toes down. That I thank you for your word. Thank you for your spirit. Thank you for whoever presented this week about this presentation. It's a good thing. I hope that we can go to the next step.
Thank you very much. And with that, I guess we'll conclude.
Good segue
yes?
to finishing.
Perfect.
Hakonabe, Inkanami Dabiabe. Chajimita with the Tangatagahe, Sweeney Wind Chief, Washijubi Magam. Wani do Chedan, Midabiabe Magam. I want to thank our panel for sharing their stories, family stories. I don't think this doesn't happen commonly on this university. So to hear everyone's history and story and the things that they brought to this room, I really want to thank you, Pinamaya, for that. We talked a little bit about the delineation of race and political status, the issues of cultural protocol and responsiveness. We talked about access to water. Back home, when I visit family, Fort Peck, Montana, and Fort Belknap, Montana, water either comes from the spring where your relatives collect it at, because there's only certain safe places to collect water, or it comes from the Culligan man in Great Falls. So, these are things that are easy to forget about when we live here in Salt Lake City in comfort, and to know that our families are still dealing with these struggles. We're reminded of that today. We heard about speaking to the youth. My nephew over here. It does my heart good to see him do his thing here, because to me this was kind of a microcosm for my experience in higher education, where on one hand we have our Indigenous way of being, where that's the future right there, and how we honor our future and take care of these guys. At the same time, we're in this place, we're in this context of higher education where there's this protocol where we're supposed to behave a certain way, or we're supposed to ask questions. I think that's something that a lot of our non-native or instructors, or even instructors in general, they grapple with, because it's not commonplace for Native people to challenge the authority. And so for me, it was kind of nice. Somebody was saying, maybe we should wrap it up. Nobody's asking questions. And for me, myself, it was nice to see this group kind of grapple with that, because that happens every day in classes that have Indigenous students here. So with that, I would like to please get a warm round of applause for our speakers. And for all of us, I would like for everyone to take something that they heard about today and make that a part of your conversation over food, or when you extend your day, when you share your day with your family or your friends. Make these conversations part of your conversation out there. That's one of the ways that we can provide access for future students here on this campus, or even into higher education, that come from Indigenous cultures. I would also like to encourage everyone to attend other events that are happening. It's not every day we get to have something like this. Once again, thank you to you for joining us.